In 1692, a small Puritan community in Massachusetts became convinced the devil was living among them. Within a matter of months, neighbors turned on neighbors, children testified against adults, and the courts began accepting dreams as hard evidence. By the time it was all over, 20 people were dead, hundreds more were imprisoned, and an entire town was left permanently scarred by its own fear. This is the true story of the Salem Witch Trials. To understand how a community could turn on itself so violently, we have to look at what Salem was like before the madness began. Salem Village was a deeply religious Puritan settlement. For the Puritans, life was a constant battle between God and the devil. They believed God's will was absolute, but also that the devil was a real, active force in the world, always looking for a way to corrupt and destroy. For them, witchcraft wasn't a fairy tale. It was a real crime, a pact with Satan, and it was punishable by death. Life in late 17th century New England was also incredibly harsh. People lived in constant fear of disease, famine, and violent conflicts with Native American tribes. Political instability back in England added another layer of uncertainty. Fear was just part of daily life. On top of that, Salem Village itself was deeply divided. There were bitter disputes between the rich and the poor, between farmers in the village and merchants in the town, and long-standing grudges between powerful families. All this tension and anxiety created the perfect storm, a community primed for hysteria. It just needed a spark. That spark came in the winter of 1692 from the most unlikely of sources. In the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began acting strangely. They would scream uncontrollably, contort their bodies into unnatural positions, and claim that invisible creatures were pinching and biting them. Local doctors were baffled. They could find no physical cause for the girls' afflictions. So they fell back on the only explanation that made sense in their world: witchcraft. Under immense pressure from the adults to name who was tormenting them, the girls pointed their fingers. The first 3 people they accused were all social outcasts, easy targets. There was Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who worked in the Parris household. There was Sarah Good, a homeless beggar known for muttering to herself. And there was Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had challenged social and church rules. They were different, and that made them dangerous. The authorities brought them in for questioning. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne denied everything. But Tituba, after reportedly being beaten by Reverend Parris, confessed. And her confession was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. She described flying through the air on a stick, seeing black dogs and red cats, and attending secret meetings with the devil, who she said appeared as a tall, dark man. She claimed other witches were working with her, signing their names in the devil's book. Tituba's story wasn't just a confession. It was a confirmation of everyone's deepest fears. The devil was here, in Salem, and he was recruiting. Panic erupted, and the accusations began to spread like wildfire. What turned this local panic into a legal nightmare was the court's decision to allow something called spectral evidence. This was the most dangerous part of the trials. Spectral evidence meant that if an accuser claimed your spirit, your specter, appeared to them in a dream or a vision and hurt them, that testimony was accepted as proof. You didn't need to be physically present. There didn't need to be any other witnesses. There was no way to defend yourself against what someone claimed your ghost did. This created a horrifying legal trap. If you were accused and you denied it, your pleas of innocence were seen as proof of your guilt. After all, a witch would surely lie. But if you confessed, even to a crime you didn't commit, you might be spared execution in exchange for naming other witches. Confession became a survival strategy. Under this twisted logic, the accusations spiraled out of control. The spring and summer of 1692 were a time of terror. Over 200 people were accused and arrested. Entire families were torn apart as husbands, wives, and even young children were thrown into dungeons. The accusations were no longer limited to outcasts. Respected church members, wealthy landowners, and even a former minister were named. The jails overflowed. Then the executions began. The first person to be hanged was Bridget Bishop on June 10th. Over the next few months, 18 more would follow her to the gallows. But the most brutal death was that of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer. He refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, knowing the court was a sham. As punishment, he was laid in a field, and heavy stones were piled on his chest to force a plea. He endured it for 2 days. His last words, as the weight crushed the life from him, were reportedly, "More weight." People confessed to crimes they never committed just to save their own lives. Children accused their parents. Friends turned against friends. Fear had completely consumed Salem. So what made it stop? The hysteria only broke when the accusers finally went too far. They began naming some of the most powerful and influential people in the colony, including the wife of the governor himself. Suddenly, the ruling elite, who had allowed the trials to happen, realized that they were no longer immune. Public opinion began to shift. Prominent ministers, like Increase Mather, started to publicly question the use of spectral evidence, arguing it was unreliable. Finally, in October 1692, the governor intervened. He dissolved the special court and put an end to the madness. The Salem Witch Trials were over. In the years that followed, there was a slow, painful reckoning. The Massachusetts government formally apologized for the events of 1692. The trials were declared unlawful, and financial compensation was paid to the victims' families. Judges and jurors issued public apologies for their roles in the tragedy. But the damage was done. The community was shattered, and the names of the 19 who were hanged and the one who was crushed to death were forever etched into history. Salem became a permanent cautionary symbol of mass hysteria, the danger of false accusations, and the terrifying consequences of what happens when fear overrules reason and justice. So what really caused it? Historians still debate the exact causes, and there's no single, simple answer. It was a complex mix of factors. Religious extremism played a huge role, creating a worldview where the devil was a constant threat. Social and economic conflicts within the village provided the fuel of resentment. Some argue the community was suffering from collective trauma after brutal wars. There's even a theory that a fungus called ergot, which can grow on rye bread and cause hallucinations and muscle spasms, might have infected the first accusers. But most agree it was not one thing. It was a perfect storm, where existing tensions and a culture of fear fed on themselves until they exploded. In the end, the Salem Witch Trials didn't prove that witches were real. They proved something far more terrifying, that ordinary people, when consumed by fear, paranoia, and a blind sense of righteousness, are capable of destroying one another and calling it justice. It stands as a dark reminder that the greatest danger often comes not from some supernatural evil, but from the darkness that can exist within our own communities and within ourselves. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into history.